Good morning and good evening to our speaker, Professor James Boyce in Massachusetts.
Good morning, all of you.
Welcome to today's talk on why carbon prices and dividends for Taiwan. My name is Qianyu Lu. I'm research fellow here at the Institute of European and American Studies, Academia Sinica. It is my great honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor James Boyce. Professor Boyce is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and Senior Fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute. He is author and editor of 19 books. You can also find his works in journals such as Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He has written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Scientific American, and Politico. As an intellectual, he is quite outspoken. He is also recipient of numerous awards. Very early on in his academic career, Professor Boyce started to focus his attention on the relationship between inequality and the environment. He pioneered in teaching a course called Political Economy and the Environment back when few people were talking or thinking about these two things in the same context. A recurring theme in his work is that more inequality leads to more environment degradation, and more environmental degradation leads to more inequality. If we want to have a chance to solve either problem, we must address both at the same time. In his 2019 book, The Case for Carbon Dividends, Professor Boyce not only illustrated why that is the case, but also offered a very concrete proposal for taking the first step to tackle both the problem of climate disruption and inequality at the same time. That book drew wide attention and praises around the world. Taiwan is in the middle of making our own climate law. This is the perfect time for us to benefit from Professor Boyce's ideas. Professor Boyce will be talking for roughly 60 minutes, followed by a Q&A session of around 20 minutes. Please join me in welcoming Professor Boyce.
Thank you, Qianyi, and thank you all for tuning in to this talk so early in the morning. As Qianyi said, what I'd like to share with you today are some thoughts about how a carbon price and dividend system could be applied in the specific case of Taiwan. I should say at the outset that I have no special expertise on Taiwan. All of the listeners will know much more about the country than I do. So I will leave it to you to fill in some of the gaps in my presentation. But I have done a little bit of research, enough to try to think about some of the issues that will arise in applying such a policy in this specific context. The basic idea of carbon dividends is that we convert what has been treated as an open access resource, the carbon absorptive capacity of the atmosphere, which has been treated as a non-property, as something that belongs to no one, that everyone can access free of charge, and therefore is subject to the so-called tragedy of the commons, better described as the tragedy of open access, which is that such a resource can be not only used but abused, and in the case of an environmental sink, a sink for pollutants like carbon dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere, the danger is that the sink will become overfull and we will experience adverse effects from that buildup of pollution. In the case of carbon dioxide, those adverse effects are what we now see unfolding in the process of global climate change, or perhaps better termed global climate destabilization, in recognition of the fact that the climate does change over time and always has, but what's happened now is that the pace and scope of change has radically accelerated with potentially very, very serious adverse consequences for future generations and adverse consequences that are already being felt here and now today. The notion of universality is one that converts that open access resource into a form of property that is owned by everyone and pays dividends obtained from charging for the use of the scarce resource to all citizens of the state instituting the policy on an equal per capita basis. Perhaps the earliest example of universal dividends of this type took place in the state of Alaska in the US when the state began pumping oil in the 1980s. The state decided that the oil of Alaska belonged to all the people of Alaska, current and future generations, and so it determined that it would charge a royalty on every barrel of oil, and it would put that money into something called the Alaska Permanent Fund. And from the Alaska Permanent Fund, annual dividends are paid out every year to every single man, woman, and child who resides in the state of Alaska. It's a very straightforward program. If you go to the website of the Alaska Permanent Fund, you can find a 2-page form that Alaskan residents fill out in order to qualify for their dividend checks. And the dividend checks are paid via the proverbial check in the mail, which in modern times, in most cases, means an electronic transfer into individuals' bank accounts. As you can imagine, this is a very popular policy across the political spectrum in Alaska. The annual payouts nowadays are averaging about $2,000 per person. So for a family of 4, that would be $8,000. For Alaska's wealthiest people, $8,000 a year isn't a great deal of money. It's perhaps a free shopping trip down to Seattle or San Francisco. But for low-income people in Alaska, which includes many indigenous Alaskans who live just above, if that above or often below the federal poverty line, that money is a very welcome addition to their annual income. In the case of carbon, we would do something similar. We would pay an annual dividend to every woman, man, and child, but in this case, the money would come not from charging a royalty on the extraction of oil, but rather from auctioning permits to import fossil carbon into the economy. Permits for the carbon embodied in every ton of coal, every barrel of oil, every cubic meter of natural gas. It's very easy to calculate that amount of carbon, and it's very easy to levy such a carbon charge, and that's already done in various carbon pricing programs around the world. Roughly 20% of the world's fossil fuels now have some sort of carbon pricing associated with them, although often the price is extremely low, as we will discuss. The idea of capping global carbon in a way that will be compatible with achieving the Paris goal of holding the increase in mean surface temperatures to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above their pre-industrial level would involve cutting emissions by something on the order of 90% between now and the middle of the century. Actually, what we need to aim for is what's called net zero emissions, but 90% assumes that we could cover the other 10% by means to step up carbon sequestration through better land use management and so on. Cutting emissions by 90% over the next 28 years means cutting emissions at a constant rate, if one did it at a constant rate, of 8% per year. The math here is the logic of compound interest operating in reverse, and this curve shows what an 8% per annum cut in carbon consumption would look like. If we want to achieve that, and we want to use a carbon price as one of the policies to help achieve it, we have a choice between having a carbon cap, a cap on the total amount of carbon allowed into the economy and ultimately then into the atmosphere, or a carbon tax. A tax sets the price and allows the quantity of carbon to vary. A cap sets the quantity and allows the price to vary. Since our main objective here is to hit the quantity target to achieve that 8% per annum reduction in the use of carbon, I think it makes more sense to have a cap rather than to have a tax. However, from the standpoint of businesses planning investment decisions for the long run, it's also helpful to have some certainty that the price of carbon and therefore the price of fossil fuels is going to rise over time. So the two policies of a cap and a tax can be combined by having both a cap that sets the limit on the total amount of carbon allowed into the country and a tax that rises over time that acts as the floor price for carbon permit auctions. If demand for permits at that price exceeds supply, then the cap kicks in and the price goes up even further. If the tax were high enough that there was no excess demand at that price, then that would be the price at which carbons are distributed under the policy. The most practical and administratively simple place to administer a carbon price, whether in the form of a cap or a tax, is through what's called an upstream system. An upstream system levies the price where the fossil fuels first enter the economy. In a fossil fuel importing economy like Taiwan, that means at the ports where oil or natural gas or coal is offloaded. At those ports, every firm bringing the fossil fuels into the national economy would be required to surrender a permit for every ton of carbon that will be, or of carbon dioxide that will be emitted when those fuels are ultimately burned. That price of carbon becomes part of the price that's then passed on to users of carbon, to consumers of fossil fuels. A downstream system, by contrast, would levy the price further down the chain. It would levy it on users of fossil fuels, potentially, for example, electric utility companies or industries or automobile drivers even. A downstream system has the disadvantage that you would have many more parties, compliance entities, who need to have permits and surrender them for each ton of carbon they're emitting. You would also have to measure how much each of them is emitting. It's much more administratively simple and less costly to levy the charge upstream where the fossil fuel first enters the economy rather than having a downstream system. Nevertheless, around the world, we do often see downstream systems of carbon pricing. And the main reason for that is these systems are partial in their coverage. They cover certain sectors of the economy, for example, electric power plants, and not other sectors. But ideally, what we want is a system that covers all sectors, treats carbon as carbon, regardless of which sector is burning it. And an upstream system does exactly that. The idea of putting a cap on carbon emissions and using a price as a way to ration the use of fossil fuels is a solution to a congestion problem, the congestion of the atmosphere with too much carbon dioxide. We're familiar with congestion problems in other contexts as well. For example, parking in urban areas. We have parking pricing solutions. This picture is parking meters, which I don't know, but I imagine you see these in Taiwan as well. They're a common sight on city streets in the United States. People put in money for every hour or day that they're parking. Similarly, parking lots have usually an hourly or daily, or in some cases, a monthly fee. That pricing solution doesn't mean that the streets are for sale or the parking lot is for sale. What it means is that the use of the parking lot is not free. The parking lot or the city streets are not an open access resource. Their use is limited and a price is charged for using them as a way to avert congestion and the overuse of the resource that could otherwise result. Having prices as part of the solution doesn't mean we don't have regulations as well. Sometimes pollution pricing, including carbon pricing, is presented as an alternative to regulation. You often find it presented this way for explanation purposes in economics textbooks, but in the real world, we typically implement the two side by side. In the case of parking, for example, there are lines showing where cars are allowed to park. They're not allowed to park in a way that blocks other cars from getting in or out of the parking lot. There are certain provisions for people who have disabilities to have certain parking spaces, and so on and so forth. Those are regulations that often go hand in hand with pricing. Similarly, in the case of carbon pricing, you could have other regulations like low carbon fuel economy standards for automobiles or renewable portfolio standards for power plants. Carbon pricing applies this same basic logic that we already use in parking lots to the atmosphere. It applies it to the parking of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere. There are four basic virtues of a carbon pricing system, four reasons why I think this is an important and desirable part of the policy mix. Again, it's not the only policy that we should implement in order to reduce carbon emissions and thereby to address the problem of global climate destabilization. Regulations are another important part of the policy mix. Investments, including public investment, are another important part of the policy mix. But carbon pricing is one of the elements, and I think it's an important one and a useful one for the following reasons. First, having a carbon price is an inevitable consequence of having a binding cap on the use of fossil fuels. If we have a cap on the use of fossil fuels, it means we're limiting their supply. And when we limit the supply of fossil fuels, their price goes up. We know this from what's happened with the periodic OPEC efforts to raise the price of oil by clamping down on the production of oil. You reduce the supply, the price goes up. The only way the price would not go up is if simultaneously demand reduction measures were being implemented that kept the demand for fossil fuels below the diminishing supply. That, history suggests, is unlikely to happen. In the past, we have never achieved sustained reductions in demand for fossil fuels of 8% per year. In fact, the only times we've reached anything like an 8% reduction in demand have been during things like the great world recession triggered by the COVID pandemic, which led in many countries to a decline in the use of fossil fuels owing to the decline in economic activity that got near 8%. However, as soon as the pandemic was over, fossil fuel use bounced back. And moreover, having a terrible recession is not a particularly desirable way to reduce our fossil fuels. Having a cap is a much more desirable way to do it because we can protect the economy, including households, by using the revenue in smart ways, as I'll discuss in a few minutes. So unless we have something, regulations, investments, recessions, that lead to a very rapid diminution in demand, if we have a cap, we're going to have increases in the price of fossil fuels. Carbon pricing, in that sense, is an inevitable consequence of any policy that keeps fossil fuels on the ground, that limits their supply. The short-run effect of a carbon price, either through auction permits under a cap or through a carbon tax, is to reduce demand. As the price goes up, demand goes down. People drive less, they may carpool to work, they may take public transportation, and so on. They may turn down the lights, use less electricity. these kinds of things. Demand doesn't reduce a lot in the short run in response to carbon pricing because demand for energy is what economists call price inelastic. That is to say, you need a fairly large increase in the price to achieve a relatively modest reduction in demand. But nevertheless, there is some effect, a short-run effect. There's also a longer-run effect, which is somewhat bigger because over the long run, people are able to adjust to higher carbon prices by investing in energy efficiency and renewable energy. For example, motorists can invest in more fuel-efficient cars, or households can invest in more fuel-efficient appliances, or businesses and electricity generators can invest in non-fossil fuel energy, including renewable energy sources. So over the long run, the price has a further incentive effect that further helps to chart the economy towards reduced use of fossil fuels. And finally, a virtue of carbon pricing, which is perhaps less well recognized because it hasn't been discussed as much, is that carbon pricing creates something I'll call carbon rent. I'll tell you a little bit more about carbon rent in a moment. It's the money that consumers pay in higher prices for fossil fuels as a result of the cap or the tax. And that money can be captured through auctions or through a carbon tax, and then used in order to reduce inequality among households via equal per person carbon dividends. So carbon rent creates an opportunity to reduce inequality. As Qian-Yi mentioned in her introduction, the relationship between economic inequality and political inequality on the one side and environmental degradation on the other is something that I've worked on now for many years, and carbon dividends are an example of a policy that addresses both issues at once, address both environmental degradation and inequality. Now that said, carbon dividends are not a complete solution to economic inequality. They by no means eliminate economic inequality, but they can have an important effect, particularly for households at the lower end of the income distribution strata, as we'll see in a few moments. This is a slide for the economists in the audience that describes what carbon rent is. It's the market for fossil fuels or fossil carbon. The S line is a supply curve sloping upward as the price goes up. Producers produce more fossil fuels, and the demand curve is the demand of consumers for fossil carbon, and it of course slopes down as the price goes up. People consume fewer fossil fuels. The demand curve, as you will see, is quite steep, and that's because, as I've mentioned, the demand for fossil fuels is price inelastic. What happens when we constrain the quantity of fossil fuels shown on the horizontal axis? That's the quantity. What happens when we have a cap? Well, the quantity of fossil fuels entering the economy is diminished, and going up that demand curve, we can see the resulting price. The price goes up, and as you can see, the price goes up more than the quantity goes down because, again, it's price inelastic. Energy is a necessity, not a luxury. The money, the extra money that consumers then pay for fossil carbon, the amounts they still consume, is what's called the carbon rent. It's the product of the addition to the price times the quantity of fossil fuels that are still consumed. It's the area shown in the shaded rectangle in this particular graph. Who pays that carbon rent? The consumers of fossil fuels pay it. They pay it in proportion to their direct and indirect use of fossil fuels. By direct use, I mean when we directly consume fossil fuels, for example, by buying gasoline or what's called petrol in England at the pump. And also for indirect use of fossil fuels, that would be the fossil fuels that are embodied in other things that we consume, including food, manufactured goods, and so on. Prices of everything go up in proportion to the amount of carbon in them, once you've introduced the carbon price, and consumers pay in proportion to their use of this carbon, in proportion to what is often called their carbon footprints. In absolute terms, of course, richer households use more fossil fuels than poorer households, so they pay more. They pay more in absolute dollar terms than do poor households because they consume so much more. They heat bigger homes, they drive bigger automobiles, they fly more on airplanes, and so on. However, as a share of their income, poor households often pay more than richer households. That is to say, even though they're paying less in dollar terms, still their incomes are so much lower that as a percentage of their income and expenditure, it hits them harder. And if that happens, as is typically the case in industrialized countries, it's certainly the case in the United States, and I'll show you some data in a moment suggesting that it is also the case in Taiwan. In that case, a carbon price is equivalent to a regressive tax. A regressive tax is one that hits the poor harder than the rich as a percentage of their income. That's what happens if you have a carbon price, ignoring for the moment what is done with the carbon rent. Once we bring that into the picture, we can change the distributional outcome quite dramatically, as I'll show. The question is, who should receive the carbon rent, the extra money that consumers are paying for fossil fuels once we have a carbon price, either from a cap or from a tax? Who should get that money? And broadly speaking, there are three options. These could be not exclusive. There could be some money allocated in different ways, but these are the three broad possibilities. The first is to let the fossil fuel corporations get the money and keep the money. That's a policy known as cap and trade, or perhaps more accurately as cap and giveaway and trade, because the way such a policy works is to give away the permits up to the levels set by the cap to the firms rather than auctioning them off. When you give them away, you have to have some formula for doing so. That formula usually is based on past emissions, or in the case of oil importing firms or fossil fuel importing firms, on the basis of the amounts they brought in the past. You give them free permits, and that's called cap and trade because in the end, some firms decide they want more permits and are willing to buy them from other firms, and other firms decide they would just as soon make money by selling their permits rather than using them themselves. So that's the origin of cap and trade. If you don't give away permits, if instead you auction them off, then you don't need to trade permits. There's no permit trading necessary with auction permits because firms buy as many as they want at the auction. The auctions typically are held every 3 months. That's the way it works here where I live in the northeastern United States, for example, in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative for power plants. And firms use the permits they buy in the auction during that quarter. And if they have extra permits left over, they can use them in the following quarter, and so on. Giving the firms free permits means you're giving them windfall profits because, of course, even though the permits are free, the price of fossil fuels still goes up because you've limited supply, just as when OPEC cuts the supply of oil, its price goes up. So free permits, a cap with free permits, is a recipe for windfall profits, and politically, that has sometimes been seen as an attraction of a cap and giveaway and trade policy. In the first decade of this century, for example, the carbon pricing bills that were introduced in the United States at the federal level were largely cap and giveaway and trade bills. And the political rationale was that by giving free permits to the firms, you would be able to co-opt them and keep blunt their efforts to lobby against the policy. In the end, it didn't work. The fossil fuel firms would be happy to have free permits as opposed to some other kind of carbon policy, but they'd rather have no carbon policy at all. And so that's what they lobbied for, and that's what they ultimately got. If you do give away permits like this, the profits, the windfall profits, are distributed among individuals in proportion to their ownership of corporate stocks. And as we know, richer households own more corporate stocks than poorer households. In fact, many poor households own no corporate stocks whatsoever. So the carbon rent in this case is distributed in a way that makes the rich richer, while the poor, as we've noted, are paying a higher share of their incomes as a result of the higher carbon price. Some of the profits under a cap and giveaway and trade system flow to foreign shareholders as well. Not all of the corporate stocks in the firms that receive free permits are owned domestically in the country implementing the system. And so such a policy also involves a potentially quite substantial leakage of the windfall profits, the carbon rent, outside of the country. So in effect, a cap and giveaway and trade policy means that you are taxing your own citizens through higher carbon, through the carbon price, through higher fossil fuel prices, and allowing some of that money to flow out of the country to foreign shareholders of the corporations that receive free permits. So that's option number one. As you may guess, it's not my favorite option. A second option is to have the government receive the rent. This is an option which could be called cap and spend in the case of a cap. It's sort of like tax and spend. The government gets the revenue, whether it's in the form of a tax or from auctions of carbon permits, and it can then spend the money however it wishes. Again, if the permits are auctioned, there's no need for carbon trading. The revenue is retained by the government, and it can be used to do anything the government decides to do. The government officials can increase spending, they could cut other taxes, they could reduce the budget deficit, they could pay down the national debt. All of these were discussed in the first decade of this century in the United States when there were carbon policies discussed in Washington by senators like the two men pictured here, the late John McCain and Joseph Lieberman. Cap and spend is basically a policy that allows the carbon rent paid by consumers through what in the US and in Taiwan would be a regressive tax to be spent by the government as the government wishes. How people feel about this system often hinges on how they feel about government. Some people feel more confident that the government will spend it on good works, others less so. The third option is to return the carbon rent to the people. This is the system that I call cap and dividend, or in the case of a carbon tax, it sometimes is called tax and dividend or fee and dividend. In the case of a cap, the permits are again auctioned. They're not given away for free. There are no windfall profits for the firms that get the permits. They have to pay for them in the auction with demand and supply setting the price. The revenue from the permit auctions is then recycled by the government, the auctioneer, to the public as equal dividends per person, much as the state of Alaska recycles its oil revenues today. Those revenues could be paid out monthly or quarterly or annually. Personally, I think more frequent payments like monthly or quarterly payments are preferable because households can use the money and it's important for them to be able to see the money coming back to them in a visible and transparent way in order to sustain their support for the policy that raises the price of fossil fuels. If they don't see the money coming back to them, if it's not visible, if they don't perceive the system as fair, then public support for the policy is likely to evaporate as fuel prices rise and they feel the pinch in household budgets. Recycling the revenue in this way protects the purchasing power of working families. In fact, as I'll show you in a moment, it increases the incomes of low-income families and many middle-income families as well, because the amount they receive in dividends exceeds what they pay in higher fossil fuel prices. When we think about who consumes carbon directly and indirectly, in addition to households who consume most of the carbon, there are also two other sectors that are important to mention. One is government, national, regional, and local governments, and the second is the export sector that uses fossil fuels to produce exports. I don't know exactly what the percentages on these three sectors would be in the case of Taiwan, but the picture here shows you the percentages here in the United States, and my guess would be in the case of Taiwan, it would not be very different from what we see here. Households would, again, consume the bulk of the carbon, perhaps 2/3 or 3/4. Government and exports would split the rest. In the case of Taiwan, the most important export industry consuming fossil fuels would be, I believe, the semiconductor industry, as I'll mention in a few moments. How should carbon rent be allocated within these sectors? We don't have to use the same system for all three sectors. We can use different systems for different sectors. In all cases, we want to provide an incentive to reduce the use of fossil fuels, but we also want to return some or all of the revenue to the parties in that sector. In the case of households, the basis for allocation in a cap and dividend system is an equal per person allocation. In the case of government, what would be a reasonable way to allocate the revenue to keep the government whole, so to speak? One way that's been proposed here in my home state of Massachusetts, for example, in carbon pricing bills, has been to return the money to state and local governments on an equal per employee basis. That way, each government unit has an incentive to reduce its own carbon footprint. It doesn't eliminate the incentive to cut their carbon footprint, as it would, for example, if you simply rebated the money based on how much they spent on fossil fuels. And insofar as it changes incentives, it not only reduces the incentive to use fossil fuels, but also perhaps gives some incentive to hire more employees for more labor-intensive hiring practices. So that's one way to redistribute the money to the government sector. In the case of energy-intensive exports, an alternative way to do it is through an ad valorem distribution. That is to say, returning carbon rent to the sector based on how much revenue each firm is making from its exports. Here again, the firms would retain an incentive to reduce their carbon emissions, since what they get back is not based on how much carbon they use, it's based on how much product they export. But it would keep the energy-intensive export sector competitive on a worldwide basis, because the money would be coming back to the sector. And indeed, it might even enhance the competitiveness of the export sector if and when other countries implement their own carbon pricing systems, and as part of those, implement what are called border carbon adjustments, as is under active discussion in both the European Union and the United States as we speak. Such adjustments would charge the firms that are exporting into the local market, into the European or the US market, based on the carbon content of their goods. And the lower the carbon content, the lower the tariff, and therefore the more competitive their goods would be. Let's say a few more words about each of these sectors before I wrap up. First, the household sector. So households, as we've discussed, would pay into the carbon rent pie according to their carbon footprints. Richer households would pay more than poorer households, but again, as a percentage of their income, the poor would pay more in many countries, including the US and Taiwan. And the households would receive equal per capita dividends. It wouldn't matter how much carbon your household consumes, the revenue comes back on an equal per person basis. All households would then have an incentive to cut their personal carbon footprints, since the amount they receive in dividends would not be affected, while the amount they spend in higher prices for fossil fuels would be decreased. So they have an incentive to invest in energy efficiency and so on. Those with above average carbon footprints, bigger than average carbon footprints, will pay more than they receive back in the form of dividends, and those with below average carbon footprints will receive back more than they pay. Their dividends will exceed what they pay. If we think about the distributional effect, what we need to look at is how carbon footprints map into the income distribution. These are data from the World Inequality Database developed by the French economist Thomas Piketty and his colleagues in Paris. And these are the data for Taiwan. For the richest 1% of households, that's the top blue line, for the next 10%, and for everyone else. And as you can see, richer households consume more carbon. It varies a bit, fluctuates a bit over time, but in general, the wealthier the household, the bigger their carbon footprint. And in the case of the top 1% of households, the carbon footprints are a lot bigger. But the top 10% are bigger than everyone else as well. The World Inequality Database provides such data on a decile by decile basis. That is to say, for each 10% of the income distribution, given, and this is a picture of the more detailed data, which gives us a sense of how carbon footprints vary across income classes. And using those data, we can ask the question, well, what would happen if we had a carbon price on the household sector and recycled the money equally across all households on an equal per person basis? What would be the distributional effect from some households paying more than other households and everyone getting an equal dividend based on the principle that they all own equally the right to use the limited carbon space? The distributional impact of the carbon price, as I've mentioned, would be regressive. This is just looking at the higher price of fossil fuels alone without considering what happens to the carbon rent. So in the bottom quintile, that is to say the poorest 20% of the population, we see that if the carbon price were $100 per ton of CO2, which is probably not an unreasonable price for the initial years of such a program, where we've got a cap cutting emissions at 8% per year, then the cost of higher fossil fuels would be equivalent to roughly 4% of the household's total income or total expenditure. In this case, it's income data. And in the case of the richest quintile, the richest 20% of households, it would be equivalent to about 1.7% of their total income. And that again is because fossil fuels are a necessity, not a luxury, and as a percentage of their income, the poor pay more than the rich. These again are data for Taiwan, but you can find a similar pattern for most, if not all, advanced industrialized countries, including the United States. What happens if the carbon rent from the household sector is returned to the households on an equal per person basis? This figure shows the net effect, where the bar now above the 0% line represents positive impacts, net impacts on household income, and where the bars go below the 0% line, it's a negative impact on household income. And here we see for the poorest 20% of households that the net impact this combines the impact of the higher carbon price and the dividend is to raise their incomes by 7%. So that extra money coming in the form of dividends far outweighs what they pay in higher prices for fossil fuels. And as we can see, the effect is positive also for the next 20% and the middle 20%. The 20% above that, they more or less break even. And it's only really the top 20% that has a noticeable negative impact on their net incomes because of their outsized carbon footprints. They consume above average amounts of carbon, so they get back less in dividends than they pay in higher prices. But these, of course, are precisely the households that can afford that effect. The net effect of the program, then, is to help equalize income distribution. Again, it's not a solution for inequality, but it does mitigate the problem of inequality, which is a serious problem around the world, perhaps not quite as serious in Taiwan as it is in my own country, I'm sorry to say, but nevertheless, it's a problem just about everywhere. And such a system would mitigate inequality. And as the carbon price goes up, as the cap tightens, or the carbon tax, if that's the system, increases, then these effects become even bigger. How is it possible that there could be such a big effect on the bottom 20% with a relatively modest effect on the top 20%? The reason, of course, is that the amount of income we're talking about for the top 20% is much greater than the incomes of the bottom 20%. So a reduction of income at the top 20% of about 1% can generate rather large increases in income in the bottom strata of the income distribution. The idea of distributing the carbon rent amongst households in this equal per capita way is consistent with the philosophical principle that the gifts of nature, in this case, the limited carbon absorptive capacity of the atmosphere, belong to us all in equal and common measure. They're not privileges that should be bestowed on the basis of political power. They're not commodities that should be allocated on the basis of purchasing power. These are universal rights, universal assets, universal property that belongs to us all. And that principle, I think, is quite widely shared across cultures all over the world. This picture is an excerpt from a mural painted by the great Mexican artist Diego Rivera that I came across in the Ministry of Education in Mexico City one time. And I saw Rivera's inscription there written in somewhat antiquated Spanish, which said, translating, "The earth belongs to all, like the air and the water and the light and heat of the sun." Universal dividends are consistent with that principle that the gifts of nature belong to us all. Let me now turn to the government sector, where we've got both a national government and regional and local governments. You will know what the administrative divisions are in the case of Taiwan. In the case of governments, again, they pay according to the carbon footprints. A local government that uses more fossil fuels will pay more than a local government that uses less. And returning the money back to them on an equal per employee basis means that all the governments would still have an incentive to reduce their carbon footprints, but the government sector as a whole would be kept whole. So all the governments would have an incentive to reduce their use of carbon, but the government sector is kept whole. It wouldn't shrink the size of government. It wouldn't increase the size of government. It would be what economists call a revenue neutral policy. Those government units with below average per employee use of fossil carbon would come out ahead. What about the export sector? Here, the relevant subsector is what are called energy intensive trade exposed industries. That is to say, industries that use a lot of energy and that engage in trade. The abbreviation for these is EITEIS. You find this in a lot of the economic literature on trade effects of carbon pricing. So once we have a global economy, we realize that there are problems of competitiveness for firms that are impacted by domestic environmental policies, including carbon pricing, and firms that are energy intensive are particularly attuned to that issue and therefore are particularly likely to be concerned about how the introduction of a carbon pricing system would impact them. One way to address that concern is to rebate the export share of the carbon rent back to the export sector. In my view, this should be limited to the energy intensive subset of the export sector. Rebate what they're paying as a result of higher fuel prices to them, and do so on a per dollar value basis, so that firms would be paying according to their carbon footprints and receiving rebates based on how much they produce, how much they export. So firms would have an incentive to reduce their carbon footprints. This wouldn't affect the size of their own rebates. And so you would maintain the salutary effects of a carbon price in terms of incentivizing short run and long run reductions in the use of fossil fuels. All exporters would have that incentive to cut their carbon footprints. Competitiveness of the export sector would be maintained, and indeed, as I've mentioned, enhanced if the importing nations adopt border adjustment policies. If they institute, for example, their own carbon pricing system, having such a system in place in Taiwan would mean that your industries would be protected from the impact of carbon pricing in other countries that might otherwise result in higher tariffs on your goods and therefore less competitiveness. Those firms with below average carbon per unit output would again come out ahead. But the export sector as a whole and the competitiveness of those energy intensive exporters would be maintained. So to wrap up, why carbon prices and dividends for Taiwan? The first reason, and indeed in many ways the most important reason, is to combat the climate crisis, to combat climate destabilization. Now, of course, Taiwan's own emissions are a relatively small fraction of the total global emissions, and to combat the global climate crisis, we need countries around the world to cut their carbon emissions. I think the ideal way for them to do so is by adopting a policy of the sort I've just described, a cap and dividend policy, alongside complementary policies like regulations and public investments to reduce demand for fossil fuels. Have a hard cap on the supply of fossil fuels, do what you can to reduce demand through regulations and public investments and so on. But if those reductions in demand aren't enough, the hard cap kicks in and the carbon price results. The return of that money to households via equal per capita dividends can help to secure public support for carbon prices. Otherwise, I'm afraid it's almost inevitable that carbon prices, if they're substantial enough to really have an impact on the use of carbon, are going to generate a backlash from the public as they face the pinch of higher fuel prices. And that backlash is likely to be particularly strong among working people who already are having difficulty making ends meet. We saw that backlash in France after President Macron raised the fuel prices, fuel taxes, back in November of 2018 with the outbreak of what became known as the Yellow Vest movement. There were demonstrations across the country, sometimes paralyzing transport, It was a major outcry, which ultimately caused the Macron government to back down. And that was triggered by what really was a relatively modest increase in the prices for petrol and diesel. The kind of carbon pricing regime that would be associated with cutting emissions at the pace needed to be consistent with the Paris Agreement target would be, in all likelihood, much bigger price increases, and the backlash would be even greater unless the money is returned to households in a fair and transparent fashion through the proverbial checks in the mails or deposits into people's bank accounts in a way that they can see, in a way that they regard as fair, and in a way that more than compensates them for the higher fuel prices in the case of the majority of the households. Not again for the most affluent or wealthiest households, but again, they can afford to take the hit. Keeping the government whole via equal per employee rebates or some similar way of allocating across local, regional, and national governments is important because otherwise the carbon price would conceivably have an adverse impact on governments which themselves struggle for revenue. For example, here where I live in the northeastern United States, local school boards spend a lot of money heating their schools in the winter. And a carbon price would raise the prices of fossil fuels and raise the prices of heating. And you need a system to keep school boards financially viable in the face of rising carbon prices, while at the same time preserving their incentive to invest in energy efficiency and so on, which a carbon price and rebate system would do. In the case of the export sector, specifically the energy intensive exporters, returning the money to that sector on an ad valorem basis across the firms per dollar value of exports would maintain the competitiveness of the export sector and again, potentially enhance its competitiveness if and when other countries in the world move to adopt carbon pricing systems of this type or another type. So for all of these reasons, I think the idea of a carbon price and dividend system can and should be taken seriously for Taiwan, and indeed for every country in the world. My hope is that as countries begin to adopt this system, and as the benefits and efficacy of the system are demonstrated, other countries will follow suit. The countries that go first will be the leaders, and others will be followers. And the country which is leading today is Canada, which has implemented a carbon price and dividend system in not all of its provinces, but in all the provinces that didn't already have a carbon price, which include provinces with more than half of Canada's population. And that carbon price and dividend system will be a demonstration, I think, for the rest of the world. The initial Canadian system, when it was first implemented 3 years ago, had two major flaws. The price was set very low, and the money was returned via an adjustment of income taxes rather than in the more visible fashion of bank transfers. But now, as of this year, both of those flaws have been remedied. The price has been, the carbon tax has been increased substantially, and the money is being sent through direct payments, dividend payments, rather than being buried and hidden in an adjustment to the income tax. So it'll be interesting to see in the next couple of years how the Canadian system fares. My hope is that other countries will look at it and say, hey, we can try that too. And my expectation is that once they start getting the money in their bank accounts, this system will be quite popular amongst the majority of Canadians. So I'll conclude there. We can open it up to questions if you have any. If you're interested in reading more about this, here are a few suggestions. The first two are writings of mine about carbon dividends. And the third is a book by a man named Peter Barnes, which came out just last year, which is about universal property more generally, but includes a lot about carbon dividends. And indeed, I should acknowledge my debt to Peter Barnes, because I first heard of this idea from him more than 20 years ago. And the two of us have worked on this together over the years. There are also some videos about this. One is by Robert Reich, who teaches at the University of California, Berkeley, and used to be the Secretary of Labor, or what you would call a labor minister in the national government here in the United States. And it's a new video that looks at this question in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its impact on world energy prices. And then I've also included a link to a short video I made, which is basically an extract from a lecture about carbon pricing that discusses revenue allocation and goes through, again, the logic for a cap and dividend system. So thank you very much. Again, I appreciate you tuning in this morning, and I'm happy to answer any questions for the next 20 minutes or so, if you have them.
Thank you so much, Professor Boyce. That was so perfect on the time, on the timing, and also such a clear and rich, so informative and thought-provoking. And I'm sure in our audience, people have a lot of questions. If you have questions, you can use there's a hand sign at the bottom of the WebEx window. So you can click on that hand and I'll see you. So when you ask a question, please first let us know who you are. And if you feel more comfortable asking the question in Chinese, I think that I'll do too. I'll do my best to translate. And the other option, which is not so ideal, is to write in the chat area. So I want to just first add to the list that you see here for the reading and videos. I have actually written a short book review on the first book listed here, The Case for Carbon Dividends. If you go to our institute, the Institute of European and American Studies, if you go to our Idea Lab, it's called Farm for Change. You'll see there's a link of the book review that I have written for that book, and it's in Chinese. So today's talk is part of the program of Farm for Change, which is an interdisciplinary idea lab of our institute. And we focus on the environment, especially climate change, but also things like organic farming. And what we do is we want to, other than doing research, we want to plant seeds of good ideas. And we water them and we hope to see them grow. And I think today's talk is a wonderful opportunity for us to plant this seed of good idea, because I think very few people in Taiwan have heard of the idea of carbon dividends. But I think most in the audience, after you've heard what carbon dividends stand for, I think most of us, I don't think there will be many in our audience who are in the very top of our income distribution. So most of us can benefit financially, but more importantly, it's for the environment. We can tackle the problem. It's also a very serious problem in Taiwan, inequality. We can tackle that problem at the same time to not only reduce emissions, but also make our air cleaner. That's right. Also a good side benefit. So, so if you have any question, please use that sign. Click on the sign of the. Nina has raised a hand. Okay, I cannot see. Okay, Nina, go ahead, please.
Hi, Dr. Boyce. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Actually, my background is from Earth Science, and I'm from the Institute of Earth Science in also Academia Sinica. Because just now at the very end, you mentioned that there are already countries like Canada, they have already deployed this dividends system. So I'm very curious, can you talk a little bit more about, like, for example, they receive a check or whatever form for the money from the dividend. Can you tell us how much is that? Because I always wonder how much will make people feel, oh, I really feel I'm contributing. And then, to us, because at the very beginning you said that the dividends from the Alaska Permanent Fund is like $8,000 per year. To us is actually a lot. And of course, people will feel, they receive something. So I'm wondering how much should be a, sensible carbon dividend for people to have this incentive. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, of course, the main incentive from such a system is to reduce one's use of fossil fuels, and the dividend is what makes it palatable to have the higher fuel prices that generate that incentive. And the higher the price, the bigger the carbon rent, and therefore the more money that is available for dividends. So the size of the dividend depends very much on the price. And the price in turn depends on how tight the cap is. If the cap is a rather loose cap, like the one they introduced in the European Union's emissions trading system, for example, or the one in California, which has a cap and trade system, then the carbon price tends to be rather low, too low to really produce emissions reductions at the pace and scale needed to achieve anything like that 8% per annum reduction that would be needed to achieve the Paris climate goal of stabilization between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So I think the amount of money that comes back would depend on what the price is, and the price would depend on how tight the cap is, or how high the tax is, which is equivalent. Now, in the case of the Canadian system, as I mentioned, they started out with a very, very low carbon price. I think the initial carbon price was 10 Canadian dollars per ton of CO2. So as a rule of thumb, this is the rule of thumb I use here in the United States, $1 per ton of CO2 adds 1 cent to the price of a gallon of gasoline or petrol at the pump. So $10 would add 10 cents. Now that's not enough to have any noticeable impact on people's use of fuel, of carbon. Just in the first 6 months of this year, gasoline prices here in the United States rose by almost $2. That would be equivalent to a $200 per ton of CO2 carbon charge. And no one said, oh, we're solving the climate crisis thanks to these high prices. There was a lot of public outcry because people were pinched by those high prices, including from politicians who said we must bring down the price. But the kind of price one would need to have to achieve an 8% per year reduction in emissions might start out at $100 per ton, but it would probably escalate pretty significantly year after year, maybe going up by something like $100 per ton per year. So in year 2, it would be 200 to get that further 8% reduction in demand. In year 3, $300 per ton. By year 10, you're talking about $1,000 per ton, conceivably, depending on how much demand reduction investment takes place in the private sector, partly as a result of the carbon price and partly as a result of other government policies, complementary policies. So we can't really know in advance how big the dividends are going to be. But what we can know in advance is that the majority of households will receive dividends that more than offset the impact of higher prices. In the Canadian case, this will be the first year in which the carbon price has been high enough to generate a really significant amount of revenue, and it will be the first year in which that comes back to Canadians in a way that they can actually see it via deposits into their bank accounts or checks in the mail for the people who don't have bank accounts. Whereas before it was a very small amount of money that affected people's income taxes, and nobody even, most Canadians didn't even realize they were getting a dividend. And in any case, it was so small that it didn't really matter. So how much will it be that year? Well, we'll have to see what the final score is. I don't think it will be as big as the dividends that came out of the Alaska Permanent Fund of $2,000 per person or $8,000 for a family of 4. But I think it's quite possible that the dividends with the Canadian price and the Canadian system will be somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 or $500 per person per year. So that would mean $1,500 or $2,000 for a family of 4, which is not enough to make a huge difference in family budgets, but nevertheless is a significant amount of money. Nobody's going to turn up their noses at that money, and particularly for low income households, this would be a substantial amount of money. And again, it would more than offset the higher prices of fuels. One other thing I'll mention about Canada, just because you raise it, is that each country can and in some cases perhaps should adapt the system to its local or national special characteristics. So in the case of Canada, it's a very big country with much of it very sparsely populated. And so in rural parts of the country, people have to drive long distances. And so they are forced to spend more on transportation fuels than people who live in cities, where the majority of the Canadian population, in fact, lives. So what the Canadians government did with its system was they added a special extra amount in the dividends to rural households in order to try to compensate for the fact that they anticipated that rural households would feel a particularly tight pinch in the case of transportation fuels. So that's the kind of adaptation that they made in Canada. Taiwan would be quite a different case, I imagine. But again, what that illustrates is that there is scope for tailoring the policy to the specifics of individual countries.
Since I don't see any hand raising for now, so I myself have a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask one that's related to the previous one, which is, I'm not an economist, so the problem of inflation, how does inflation interact with carbon dividend? Does it make more sense, or is it an obstacle to promote this idea?
Well, the problem with inflation is that prices go up, and not everybody's purchasing power, not every household's purchasing power, not every firm's purchasing power, not every government's purchasing power goes up in tandem with the rising prices. So inflation essentially redistributes income from those who are paying higher prices to those who are charging higher prices. And different items in the consumption basket go up at different rates. So in the case of carbon pricing, this would affect the price level insofar as fossil fuels are part of the total basket of consumption goods. And of course they are. They're an important part of the basket. I mean, obviously not the biggest thing in the basket, but they're a big part of, they're a significant part of the basket. Just as healthcare costs in the United States are another big part of the basket that affects the rate of inflation. So what a carbon price and dividend system would do is it would raise the prices of fossil fuels. And so the way that inflation is typically measured, it would show an increase in the price level associated with the increase in prices of fossil fuels. Now, that would actually have no adverse effects on anyone because the money would be coming back to households or to governments or to energy intensive export industries in the ways that I've described. Now, there is actually an alternative to having the general price level affected by the inflation, which is you could, and this is something that remains to be done because Canada is so far the only country that's implemented such a system, but it would be perfectly possible to compute the inflation index, taking out the carbon price from the price index. So you would be mapping changes in the underlying price of fossil fuels, the price at which they're arriving in the country, which is basically the world market price of fossil fuels, but you wouldn't be having the impact from the tax. And indeed, that's the way that other types of taxation often are treated in inflation calculations. They're not factored into the general price level, but they do affect people's purchasing power positively or negative, depending on what happens to the tax revenue. So, so I don't think it's something that one really needs to worry about much. If I were working in the department of the government that produces the annual inflation statistics or monthly inflation statistics, and if a carbon dividend system were or carbon pricing system of any type really were introduced in my country, and if it was a significant enough price to have some noticeable effect on prices of fossil fuels, then I would probably want to think about what's the best way to address that in the computation of the inflation statistics. But in any case, I don't think it's something that really one should lose any sleep over or worry about.
Thank you. And also I want to ask, to me, I'm already converted before I listened to this lecture. I read the book, and it does sound and look perfect to me. And you also mentioned because of the dividends, it should enjoy wide public support. But given that, why, and also for that same reason, politicians, congressmen, congresswomen, they should race to promote such an ideas. But what is the obstacle? What's keeping countries from adopting such a policy?
This is a very good question, and I would say the short answer is that most people have never heard of the idea, and the reason they've never heard of the idea is nobody pays anyone to tell them this idea. There's no market for this idea on the part of deep pocket funders. Whereas, for example, policies that would make some parties, some sectors, some firms rich, there's a lot of funding for distributing those ideas. So if you're thinking about, I can illustrate this by going back to the cap and trade debates in Washington in the first decade of the 21st century. I was once on a phone call with some big environmental NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and they were talking about trying to build support for passing the legislation. And at that time, in addition to the cap and trade bill that was under consideration, which was something known as the Waxman-Markey bill, there were also cap and dividend proposals, actually, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, but the Democratic leadership at the time had decided not to push the cap and dividend idea, but instead to push the cap and giveaway and trade idea. And the rationale, their rationale, was the notion that this would blunt the opposition from the fossil fuel lobby. So we were talking about this in this conference call, this telephone call, and I was arguing in favor of supporting the cap and dividend bills rather than the cap and trade bill that the mainstream of the Democratic Party establishment was supporting. And the lobbyists for the big environmental NGOs in Washington said, well, you can't do that. And I said, why not? And they said, well, because if you don't give free permits to the fossil fuel corporations, they'll deploy their lobbyists to defeat the bill. So we need to neutralize them by giving them windfall profits. And I said, but those windfall profits would come at the expense of every American consumer and would hit the poor in particularly. And why not worry about them too? What do we need to do to get their support? And they said, no, you don't understand. Here in Washington, it doesn't matter what the voters want. What matters is what the lobbyists want. And I said, well, it would be nice to live in a real democracy or something. I said, actually, let us assume a democracy. And they all laughed. They thought that was a funny comment, to assume that we live in a democracy. But, compared to many countries, we are somewhat democratic in the United States. But in this respect, I have to say, a lot of our discourse about public policy is driven by deep pocket donors who have money to support politicians and money to disseminate ideas via various platforms to the public and the media. And so far, there hasn't been any comparable funding or dissemination for the idea of dividends. And that, I think, has been the biggest obstacle. Now, that said, I think we're starting to see a change. Not only the fact that Canada's introduced such a system, which is, of course, potentially very important, but here in the United States, in Washington, now, whereas, back in the first decade of the century, there were a couple price and dividend bills, but the rest were all cap and giveaway and trade centered bills. Now, there are still a number of carbon pricing bills in Washington. Virtually all of them now propose to return the money to the public as dividends. The bills differ in many respects in terms of how aggressively they seek to reduce emissions, how high the price is set or how tight the cap is set, and so on and so forth. But they all have now, I think, got the message that dividends is a much better way to go. And I think partly that's a result of the failure of the so-called realpolitik strategy of the first decade of trying to buy out the fossil fuel companies, which turns out not to have been so realistic after all. Partly it may also be the impact of watching what happened in France and realizing that a similar issue would exist here in the United States. That said, last thing I'll say about this is that here in the United States, unfortunately, to my point of view, the lesson the Democratic Party took from the failure of the cap and trade bills in the first decade was first not to even try to work on carbon anymore under the Obama administration. And then, of course, it was dead in the water under Trump, who was a climate change denier, and the majority of the Republican Party now being in the thrall of Trump take the same kind of line. But what the Biden administration has done is it's decided, well, we don't want to talk about raising prices of fossil fuels because that's politically controversial and could lead to a backlash. what we'll talk about instead are carrots, not sticks, but carrots. So carrots in the forms of tax credits, carrots in the form of subsidies, carrots in the form of public investments. That will be the focus of our policy, and that's what's in the bill, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that President Biden signed into law recently. I think carrots are good. I don't think that's a bad law. I'm glad they're doing that, but even by their own possibly somewhat optimistic calculations of the proponents of the bill, it's not going to reduce emissions rapidly enough to be on a Paris-consistent path. So I think we also need to have a cap, and we need to deal with the consequences of the cap, which will be higher prices, and we need to deal with the political backlash that those higher prices will lead to by returning the money to the public as dividends. So I think we're moving in that direction, but the progress has been slow, and it's been slow for the reasons I've just sketched, including the fact that no one, I've been working on this for years, Chen. No one has ever paid me a dime to write about this or talk about this. I do it because I think it's important, not because anybody offers me a pot of money to go around disseminating the idea. And everywhere I've spoken about it, and I've spoken about it in many gatherings around the US in particular, I pretty much always get a reaction similar to the one you just had, which is people say, this is a great idea, makes perfect sense to me. Why haven't I ever heard of it? And I always tell them, well, the main reason is nobody's paying anybody to tell you about it. If you want it to happen, you need to tell your neighbors. It really is going to require a grassroots movement from the bottom up, because no one's going to get rich from a price and dividend policy. There are no big windfalls for any vested interests. It simply is something that helps to protect the Earth's climate for present and future generations, protects the purchasing power of working families, and makes a dent in inequality. The beneficiaries are diffuse, but they're numerous and very important. So I think that's the way it's going to happen. It's going to happen through getting the word out, and I appreciate your having given me the chance to, as you put it, plant this seed in Taiwan. And I certainly hope it takes root there and grows. And anything I can do after this to help that process along, you should just let me know.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I see Professor Xiao raising his hand. Professor Xiao is an economist from Academia Sinica. He is kind of like you. He is also, for a long time, he is a strong activist in environment and ecology, and he has been a strong voice to promote equality when the government draft laws on climate change and other environment-related laws. So, Professor Xiao?
Yeah, thank you, Boyce, Professor Boyce. I'm very happy to hear your talk, and it's what we need right now in Taiwan. Because short of time, I have two questions. The first one is a short one: is why this kind of carbon dividends policy has been accepted in many provinces in Canada. So it's what's the difference between Canada's politics and the US? And because we like to know more about a successful story. Yeah. Because in Taiwan we have a similar problem. Especially the opposition comes from opposition to the carbon tax and the dividends. This kind of policy or energy tax and the dividends has been proposed many years ago, around more than 10 years ago, but always opposed by industries. Industry in Taiwan is the major interest group in Taiwan, just like in the US. So that's the first question, why it is successful in Canada or other European countries.
Okay. Well, should I take that one first and then we can do your second question? All right, and let me say, Professor Zhao, it's very nice to meet you virtually. I'm delighted to hear about the work you've been doing there in Taiwan. I don't know enough about Canada to really give you a clear and well-grounded answer to that question. I think in general, Canada has been, tends to be more progressive, shall we say, than the United States. Canada, for example, has had for a long time a national healthcare system, healthcare free for every Canadian, whereas the US still doesn't have such a system. The only major industrialized country in the world not to have one. So there are differences in the politics and the political climate that may be part of the story. That, as a result of that, a number of Canadian provinces had already implemented carbon pricing policies of one sort or another. The most famous is probably the carbon tax system in British Columbia, but there are other policies in other provinces as well. So when the Trudeau government came to power, Trudeau made climate change one of the issues on which he ran, because I think he figured that for the majority of Canadians, this was something that they cared about. And when he came into power, he grappled with the question of how to introduce carbon pricing in the provinces that did not yet have it. And that included Ontario, the most popular province of Canada, which has about 40% of the national population. And so he hit upon the idea of dividending the money back. How he hit on that idea, who he was talking to, where it came from, is a story that I still don't know. I'm very curious to find out about that too. And I hope someday I'll meet someone in Canada who can explain it to me, or maybe someone will write about it. But as I mentioned, initially it was introduced in a rather hobbled form, a weak form, a low price, the money rebated, not in a visible fashion, but instead through income tax. And so the other thing I'd be very interested to learn about is who and how did the policy get changed in the last year to make it a much more substantial price and to make the dividends much more visible. I don't know exactly how they pulled it off, but I'm impressed that they did. That said, they have faced opposition from the Conservative Party in Canada, which has continued to repeat the old line that carbon taxes are bad for working families. They're, a regressive tax. They'll hurt your family's budget. Basically making that argument while ignoring the fact that dividends dramatically change the impact of the policy. So it'll be interesting to see if once these bigger dividend checks start arriving, if the Conservative Party in Canada basically gives up on this and decides that they're going to accept the policy rather than continuing to oppose it, because politically, I suspect opposing this policy will be a losing proposition in most parts of the country. The one exception might be the province of Alberta, where they have the big tar sand extraction, which means there's a big vested interest from the fossil fuel companies. In the case of Taiwan, you don't have big fossil fuel companies, right? So when you're talking, at least not producing fossil fuels domestically. So my assumption would be the industries that are opposing it or have opposed carbon pricing in the past would be big export oriented or trade exposed industries that are energy intensive and worry this would diminish their competitiveness vis-a-vis foreign competitors. And I think for that reason, it's important to think about how to rebate money to the energy intensive trade exposed industries like semiconductors without diminishing their incentive to reduce their carbon footprints. And I think any enlightened leader of such a firm would realize that this would not harm their competitiveness, and indeed in the long run would potentially enhance it as countries move around the world to reduce carbon and introduce border carbon tariffs or adjustments as part of the policy mix. So, you know, enlightened corporate leaders in my country are often in short supply. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case there too. But there've got to be some of them. And I think it's important to be open to them and to try to present this in a way that makes it clear that one's not ignoring the real concerns that they bring to the table. You had a second question. I'll try to give a short answer because I know we're running out of time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Before I ask the second question, I'd like to let you know that there has been a paper written by my colleague in Taiwan in Chinese to introduce the carbon tax and the dividends system of British Columbia several years ago. Okay, so this case is well known, or not well known, but many people know this case in Taiwan. But since there's a lot of new development in Canada, and for example, the national policy, national carbon tax and the dividends. So I'd like to know more about the current situation, in Canada, including several provinces and Canada as a whole. And maybe if I'm looking for this kind of information and papers, and if you know any, please let me know. Yeah,
and vice versa. Let me ask you, if you find any, please let me know.
I mean, it's easy to find. We can just go Google.
Well, I go on Google too. I've looked, but so far it may be too early for papers to have emerged. I think academics tend to have long lead times. Yeah.
Actually, there are several academic papers studying the impacts of this system in British Columbia.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because
papers
it has been there for more than 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no,
so there are several papers. Okay. Okay. So for my second question is that usually we call dividends, carbon dividends. We only in environmental economists, usually we propose to give back the carbon tax revenue to the general public, and maybe with a higher proportion to low-income people. And in your speech or in your book, you say we need to rebate this carbon dividends to the three sectors. One is the public, the other one is governments, and the third one is export sectors. Yeah, and yeah, it's I believe it is because the reason to do this is to try to secure the public support. Not only public support, but the support from the industries or export or that energy intensive industries. Maybe that's the reason. But I know this is a good reason for doing that. But I'd like to point out that there may be a long run distortion of this kind of rebate to exports or to industries. That's this kind of a rebate may make the economic structure or the industry structure toward energy intensive and or pollution intensive. That's the case. Actually, this is the case in Taiwan. We have this kind of rebate for industries, not from tax revenue, but or not from carbon tax revenue, but from the general tax revenue. Okay, government, general tax revenue. Government has this kind of rebate for more than 50 years. 50 years for energy. They say that's a rebate for that's a subsidy for energy saving, energy conservation investments. So that's the result. After 20, 30 years, make Taiwan's industrial structure as right now, it is energy intensive industry.
Interesting,
That's a very that's a long run impact. And the other one is that it is very difficult to distinguish export sectors from other sectors. Say, oh, only these sectors can get a rebate and the other sector cannot get. Then that's a very difficult one for the government if they want to do this. That's and because everyone will say I'm an export sector. I mean,
Well, presumably,
okay, that's my question. The second one.
Okay, So those are very interesting points, and obviously you know much more about the situation and the history there in Taiwan than I do. I would just say that I think politically it is important to think about how to address the legitimate interests of energy intensive trade exposed industries. Now, in most countries, that is a very small fraction of the total industrial sector. I mean, when I worked on this whole issue in California some years ago, we ended up reckoning that only about 2% of the total carbon revenue generated by the cap and trade system would need to be rebated to these energy intensive industries. It was basically cement producers and oil refiners. In some places, aluminum, the aluminum industry is energy intensive. But I think in Taiwan, maybe partly as a result of the government subsidy programs you've described, the energy intensive trade exposed sector is a more substantial slice of the economy, and therefore its political importance would be commensurately higher. And my impression is the semiconductor industry in particular is both important in quantitative terms, export value, jobs, all of that, and also important in terms of energy use, electricity use. So I think that's actually why I inserted into this talk a bit more discussion of the export sector than I normally do. Normally, this is just a small side issue that I don't devote much time to discussing. But I thought for the Taiwanese context, it probably made sense to think about it a little more deeply. Now, whether what I've proposed would be the best way to go about handling the issue, I don't know. I mean, you and your colleagues are much better placed to think about that. But I think what's important is to have a policy which manages to do two things at once. On the one hand, give those industries an incentive to reduce their carbon footprints, to increase energy efficiency, to source more of their energy from renewable sources. And on the other hand, while giving them that incentive through higher prices for fossil fuels, at the same time, not seriously diminish their competitiveness vis-a-vis international competitors, international rivals. And so that's the delicate balancing act. How do you raise the fossil fuel prices to provide the incentives that we need to reduce carbon consumption, at the same time not seriously adversely impact their competitiveness? And I think capturing the revenue that comes from the fuel consumption by that subset of the industrial sector that's producing energy intensive exports, returning it to those same firms, but doing so not on the basis of their carbon footprints, but on some other basis like their export revenue, is a way to combine the salutary positive incentive effect of higher fuel prices on carbon consumption with maintaining the competitiveness of the sector as a whole. Now, some firms might become less competitive because they are more carbon intensive in their production processes. And other firms, by the same token, would become more competitive because they're less carbon intensive in their production processes. That kind of change I would view as a healthy change. I mean, firms become more or less competitive for a variety of reasons that have to do with the efficiency of their production process. Efficiency can and should be measured in a way that takes into account carbon footprints and the negative impacts of fossil fuel consumption on the environment. And that's what such a policy would begin to do. But again, I invite you and your colleagues to think more about whether that's what I've suggested is a reasonable idea or whether there are better ways to do it. But I suspect one way or another, as you mentioned, if industry's been a major obstacle to getting a serious carbon price off the ground, addressing the reasons for that that opposition in a way that bring them in under the tent, so to speak, in advocacy for carbon pricing. If it can be done, it's a good idea. You know, I mentioned how in the United States they tried to do that with windfall profits. I think that's a terrible idea. You don't give away free permits as a way to buy support from industry. But something structured like this for the energy intensive trade exposed industries seems to me to be compatible with the overall aims of the policy and may make it politically more palatable. So I guess I'll have to stop there. I know I've run over time, and I apologize for my long-winded answers. It's an occupational hazard of being a professor, I'm afraid. But I thank you all again for tuning in. Thank you for the very good questions. Jian-Yi has my email address if anyone didn't get a chance to ask a question and wants to follow up. I should have put it in my last slide here, but feel free to contact me by email, and I'll be happy to do whatever I can to help. And please keep me apprised of any things you yourselves are doing and any progress you make. I'll be very interested to hear.
Thank you so much, Professor Boyce. It's a feast. It's a wonderful speech. So
well,
it's much appreciated. And thanks to everyone who participated in this excellent speech. Thank you.
All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right.
Good night.
Good night.
Keep in
Bye-bye.
touch.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.